ألا من كنت مولاه فهذا علي مولاه، اللهم وال من والاه وعاد من عاداه.
My name's Rebecca Masterton and I'm an academic. I got my doctorate in 2006 and I have been researching the Shi'i path since even before then, from around 2003. I'm interested to know how the mission of Hussein ibn Ali, peace be upon him, his journey from Medina to Kufa and then to Karbala has been understood from an academic perspective. I'm going to be going on a journey to meet 3 academics in the UK to discuss the life of Imam Hussein, especially in the secular Western tradition. I'm here at the Institute of Arab and Islamic Studies at the University of Exeter, and I'm about to interview Professor Robert Gleave, who's Professor of Arabic Studies. I want to explore from an academic perspective the events that led up to the Battle of Karbala. What were the forces around Imam Hussein alayhi salam, the political forces? What were the motives that were going on in Muawiyah and in Yazid and in the population in general that led Imam Hussein alayhi salam to eventually leave for Kufa? If we're looking at the figure of Muawiyah, for example, there have been some biographies written about Muawiyah that we know praise him for being an efficient administrator and that he brought unity to the Muslim world, whereas before it had been in disarray, so to speak. Although again, a lot of the sources do say that he violated basic Islamic tenets. So he used covert assassinations, threats, bribes, refused to give allegiance to the caliph of his time. How is it, in your opinion, how is it that these texts and biographies have come out about him that are praising him as a sort of good leader after Imam Ali?
I think part of the thing is that Islamic studies scholars are always looking for a new angle on an established question. And Muawiyah, generally speaking, has not been a well-respected figure even within Sunni sources. So you have an image, if you like, of Muawiyah developing of someone who was partly responsible for the different fitnas that was contributed to the end of the Rashidun period, from a Sunni perspective, and of course from a Shi'i perspective, we know that his image is of one who failed to recognise the legitimate leadership of Imam Ali. So you have a broadly negative portrayal of him within the Muslim tradition. Islamic studies scholars like to see if they can buck that trend and try and do something a little bit different and say, actually, maybe he wasn't so bad. Maybe this is all, if you like, polemic against him.
It can be seen that academia has tried to justify the position of Muawiyah by defining politics in terms of the acquisition of power and how long that power can be held.
Some Islamic scholars have been looking for ways in which they can rehabilitate him and say he wasn't so bad. And the way in which they do that is by taking the measurement of a successful political leader. what are the means whereby a leader becomes a successful leader? Do they bring unity? Do they bring a sense of order to a chaotic world? If they do that, then they're a great man. All of the great emperors through history have been judged, if you like, on their ability to produce a stable political environment, and that's not the only ways in which you can judge the qualities of a leader. And the Muslim tradition has, generally speaking, judged Muawiyah by a different set of characteristics. So you do see this sometimes.
We also have the question about Imam Hassan's capitulation to Muawiyah, because this is often seen as, his treaty that he drew with Muawiyah is seen as a sign that he condoned Muawiyah as a leader. He condoned his rulership. But in fact, we know that he drew up certain conditions within that treaty that were broken, and that he most likely also knew that these conditions would be broken. So what in your opinion, what was the reason why this treaty was drawn up? Do you think Imam Hassan, it's my opinion that he knew that Muawiyah wasn't going to stay with these conditions, but I don't know if that's correct, or whether he actually genuinely sort of was attempting some kind of...
Well, we have these personalities in early Islamic history, and sometimes they do things which seem counterintuitive from a historian's perspective, and in some ways, Imam Hassan abandoning his claim to the leadership of the Muslim community seems counterintuitive. His personality may not have been just as someone who was purely interested in political gain. And there may have been a number of other things which controlled his actions or contributed to the way in which he acted, and amongst those would have been the desire for community unity, the need for to prevent internal strife, encouraging the virtue of patience. All of these things maybe have been part of the motivation, if you like, for his actions. From a historian's perspective, we can't look into his mind, but what we have is sources which hint at the sort of person he was and the reasons why he might have acted in particular ways. So Hassan, quite possibly one of the reasons he wanted to make it very clear the terms on which he was abdicating his claim to the caliphate in favour of Muawiyah was so that the world would know what the principles were by which he was standing, and would be able, and it would be, if you like, a witness to future generations as to what happened and where the morality, from his perspective, where the morality lies in the events which were going to unfold.
I think that's a good point, because you're pointing out, and this is, I think, what we do pick up, as you say, from the actions of a lot of the imams, that sort of moral correctness was at the forefront of their thinking. So, as Imam Ali said, he could have been more tactical than Muawiyah. He had the ability, but he wasn't going to override certain moral principles. So,
well, it's an explanation of what happened.
Yeah.
We're, as historians, we're desperately trying to find explanations of why it turned out like it did.
Yeah.
The personalities that come through a reading of the sources of very strong senses of self that they have, and what matters to them, and that occasionally means doing things which from the long view of history seem unsuccessful, but trying to tease out why actors acted in a particular way in early Islamic history requires us to read the sources with a little bit of imagination in order to try and see what sort of people they were.
Yes, also, as you say, sort of looking at personalities, as well as just actions that were taken. as well. I mean, another thing that I've noticed in reading on these histories is that what we see with these events is, you know, the Bani Umayyah basically wanted to gain revenge against Bani Hashim. So things quickly reverted back to tribalism, in a sense. But I've noticed again in my own reading that this again isn't often highlighted. It's often seen that, well, you know, these were a group of personalities who knew each other, and they were sort of all acting within the general framework of Islam, and you know, events kind of unfolded as they did. But I feel, I mean, this is a key point in that there was this reversion back to a kind of a tribal mentality. I mean, have you noticed that there's a lack of emphasis on this?
Well, it's not been a major theme in terms of the Islamic historians.
Yeah.
But I think going back to what I said earlier about writers today becoming more sensitive to the variety of different sources that are available now, I think this is also true in terms of our understanding of the dynamics of tribalism in early Islamic history, and how important these tribal groups were in terms of political decision making, and that the attachment to a tribe for certain parts of the Muslim community survived the arrival of Islam, which was theoretically supposed to dissolve most of these differences, but dissolving historical structures or societal structures such as tribes is not something which can happen overnight, and tribal allegiance is something which runs very deep. So, and with tribal allegiance running deep, you also have tribal revenge being an element, if you like, of the dynamics between different groups. So it becomes something which historians are really beginning to try and come to terms with.
How much has really been understood of the extent to which the Holy Prophet's vision of a unified spiritual community was cast aside by the old pre-Islamic values of tribalism and revenge? It seems that this has only just begun to be realised by historians.
One of the underlying themes, if you like, of the transition from the Rashidun period into the Umayyad period is to what extent can tribal structures survive the coming of Islam? And the Umayyad period is if you like, a short time when the tribal structures regain strength, perhaps after a period when there was an attempt to suppress them during the time of the Prophet and during the Rashidun, and then suddenly they re-emerge. These deep felt feelings of loyalty towards one's tribe, and consequently, if one feels one's tribe has been wronged in one way or another, the immediate reaction is to try and plan and plot a revenge, and that becomes a way in which the tribe operates. And that's part of the reason why the Banu Umayyah, part of the explanation, if you like, for some of the actions against the Hashemites during the early period by the Banu Umayyah. They were fueled, if you like, by a need for revenge. Indeed, you can see it, you know, as part of the point, which part of the reasons why Muawiyah cited his one of the reasons why Muawiyah claimed he was not going to accept the caliphate of Imam Ali.
I was just going to again look at how Muawiyah was handing power over to Yazid against the conditions that Imam Hassan stipulated. He then warns Yazid not to compel Imam Hussein to give allegiance. But Yazid still, obviously, you know, as soon as he comes into power, this is what he tries to do, tries to force Imam Hussein to give allegiance. Again, I mean, obviously we can't read Muawiyah's mind, but it's an angle, again, that I was going to explore, that obviously Muawiyah must have known the nature of his own son. So was this stipulation that he gave Yazid just a matter of form to try to allay unrest in the population, or was it a genuine instruction? I mean, he must have known, knowing his own son, that he wouldn't have...
Well, there's what the potential explanations for the course of actions which Muawiyah determined upon about who his successor was going to be.
Yeah, they want to stay in power. This is
and this is so you have to understand what the motivations are for most caliphs that come to power is to how long can I stay in power, and how can I ensure a good succession to me, so that the dynasty doesn't die with me.
That's interesting. Thank you very much for a very detailed and informative discussion.
Okay, thank you very much.
So we can see from this discussion with Professor Robert Gleave the factors that went into Yazid trying to compel Imam Hussein to give his allegiance. Yazid maintained a tribal view of his society. He didn't believe in the message of Islam or the revelation or the prophethood. As far as he was concerned, he wanted to avenge Bani Hashim and take back power into the hands of Bani Umayyah. And he was determined, as a part of that, to annihilate Imam Hussein and his family. I'm here outside Edinburgh University's Centre of Islamic and Middle Eastern Studies, and I'm here to talk to Dr. Andrew Newman in order to get an academic perspective on what happened on the day of Ashura. In the academic sources, in your view, what are the different ways that Karbala has been depicted?
Right. Well, the way I have approached this, really, I think, is to expand the question, to ask a slightly broader question, to say what was the context, the larger context in early Islamic history, particularly in the Umayyad period, in which the Imam made his stand. Can we, because you have the people who won't buy anything, the texts are not reliable. So we want a kind of a non-text text, right? That's what we want, okay? And in this regard, one turns back, for example, to the book by Patricia Crone, 1986, God's Caliph, which talks about how the Umayyads viewed themselves. And what Patricia, who's presently at Princeton, was in the UK for a long time at Oxford, and then has been at Princeton for the last long number of years, was saying in that book was, well, let's put it this way, she wasn't just saying it, she was documenting it, she was getting out of the source material, the way in which the early Umayyads, both prior to Karbala and shortly thereafter, were viewing themselves or were viewed by others at the time. Now, problematically, some of these are from written sources, okay. But you have got poetry from the time, and you have got some coins. And coins, then, are part of this thing. They're a non-text text, okay, like architecture or film or painting. So we are bound by thinking, well, a text is a book, and it has, here's page 81, and here's page... No. That's not the only thing that's capable of being studied. Coins, material history can also, material culture can also be studied. So inevitably, when people circulate coins, or there's poetry, or whatever, it moves beyond the original intended audience, and other people will hear about this. And she calls attention to the fact that the coins, slightly later to this period, a couple of years later, I've got the date here someplace in my notes, the Umayyad coins were showing the Umayyads portraying themselves as Khalifat Allah. If you have Khalifat Allah, the implication is, he was suggesting, might have some antecedents in Roman history, in the authoritarian structures and intellectual understandings of rule in the region and in the world at the time, immediately prior to the rise of Islam. But if you look at it in terms of the history and the message of Islam, that's what the academics call, in my view, problematic. Okay? Little tricky. Because wasn't it the Prophet who delivered the message and called people? Okay. So aren't you then Khalifat Rasulullah? Which bespeaks the designation of the Prophet as the messenger, okay, the vehicle for the communication of the message. If you kind of forget that, or you bypass it, and it wasn't unintentional, oh, I forgot to put, you don't do that, okay? So if you are Khalifatullah, it means that Allah has designated you as the Khalifa. You are not a Khalifa in the sense of coming after, succeeding someone. Okay. Now the message changed, but there's enough incidents that Patricia has here in terms of people writing to each other, people writing to the caliph, if you will, poetry and some coins, in which it's quite clear that the notion of Khalifatullah, that is bypassing the Prophet's mission, let alone who should succeed him. If you call yourself Khalifatullah, you bypass that very thorny question of succession. If you're Khalifat Rasulullah, then you're into, well, now who should be and on what bases should somebody be the Khalifa? Just get rid of that whole problem entirely. And it's rather convenient that in these years in particular, into the Umayyad period, we'll just bypass that problem. Very thorny. We'll just ignore it, but not exactly ignore it. You're creating a fact here. How is this then interpreted, this material evidence that we have, that we can look at today? Never mind the stories and the this and the that. What can we corroborate to say what the context of Karbala was? The context of Karbala then is a bypassing of the Rasul, of the Prophet, and the question of succession, right or wrong, and saying it's a non-issue, we're just not going to talk about it. In that sense, the annual remembering of Karbala annually brings home to people that this was a statement, an action and a statement. It wasn't about taking lots of other people with you, men, women, and children indiscriminately. It was about an action, a personal decision that was made, that a stance had to be made. We call that speaking truth to power. Even though the power, right versus might, okay? They got the might, but who is in the right, okay? And does their having the might preclude you from then going on and making your statement? In this case, the Imams were going to do it, okay? And in walking into this kind of a situation, do we know his mind? It's hard to know. But we know the context and we know the issues. And the material culture only reinforces what someone of faith would understand, in my view. It complements that. It corroborates that. It says, yeah, there's something here. There is a position being taken by the people of authority. What are you going to do about it? So Yazid's frame of mind came within a larger context which preceded him, the origins of which were quite clear, that there was a bypassing of this whole issue of succession entirely, almost, again, based on the material evidence as reflected in that time, again, particularly poetry and coins and stuff, of a bypassing of the message and the messenger and saying, now we're the guys here. I mean, using that term as we'd interpret it today, Khalifatullah talks about political authority and religious authority and military authority, if you will, the latter stemming from the first two.
What do you think were the political aims of Yazid for having Imam Hussein killed in the way that he was? I mean, he didn't just execute him cleanly. He had him trampled, mutilated, almost, in the attempt to annihilate him in a way. Do you think this was a form of early terrorism, a type of early act of terrorism?
Well, I think, again, it goes to what we were saying just a couple of minutes ago about what you do, how you want to get rid of a culture, for example. And again, we were saying the way to get rid of a culture is to get rid of their written legacy. That way there's nothing left. So they will not know from whence they have come. And I think that bespeaks on the day. It's hard to say. It's really hard to say. But certainly the impact of such a methodology, as you will, rather than something more, as you suggested, straightforward, is a message there. it's not just a rejection, okay? It's a kind of an obliteration. It's trying to wipe this whole thing out. Now, you never know really what the motivations of the individuals were on the day, but the impact of it, okay? And this is the grandson of the prophet. This is a big deal. This is a big deal. Not everybody in those days, I don't think, necessarily thought that the Alid succession was right, but there was a sense of the family of the prophet. This is important. These people are important. They have something. If they're not rightful, nevertheless they are to be venerated as such. And I think you then have the Ahl Shia who believed in the succession, and others, friends, associates, colleagues, who were of a mind to feel that the Ahl Bayt were important. And to do that is to do it in this way. And then, of course, you have the question of the survivors as well. There is a sense of wanting to make sure that this, not just the people, but the idea is extirpated, obliterated. It never was here. And again, the whole question of Khalifatullah plays back into this, in my view, corroborates that that's the message on offer here. This isn't an issue. We're just not going to talk about this. And in fact, you politicize something which is not entirely just a political move. Yeah. It is about questions of salvation. It's about spiritual questions, rather than, as we might look at it today, simply an isolated political incident. That, I do not think, was the way it would have been understood at the time. And I don't necessarily think on the larger spectrum, at the political authority, the political establishment realm, with the issuance of such coin and the entertainment of such titles and the acceptance of such poetry, that this was an attempt to just bypass this issue entirely.
Even though they try to destroy the message, history shows that the truth can't be hidden forever.
History being what it is, eventually all this stuff comes out. We see that today. All the stuff that people try, oh, well, nobody will ever, oh yeah, they found out about it. And they look at it in different ways, and as we've seen from the legacy of Karbala and the nature of commemorations, they debate it and they discuss it. But in that, the core is that the idea is kept alive. Yeah. You may disagree over certain aspects of it, but we're talking about it. And that's the thing that really is important. So that we're not having a discussion about it, we are having a discussion about it. So it is continual and on an annual basis then brought home. And you see in the Abrahamic faiths and other faiths as well, this notion of the annual remembrance of this. These are important things. These were important events which set in motion trends which are still working themselves out.
And we know that the events of Karbala immediately after it happened were very traumatic for people in Iraq and in the surrounding countries. But we also know that in the Muslim world today, there are very many Muslims who don't know a lot about the events of Karbala. Do you think that there was an attempt by the caliphs who succeeded after Yazid to deliberately conceal the events of Karbala?
It's hard to say. I think you've seen over the years, particularly early Islamic histories, all the way up into the 15th century Miladi, that are predominantly written by Sunnis, and what they do, you can get interesting information out of there. Now they put it in dates, and they give you the month, and they give you the speech, and you think, oh, were you there at the time with a digital tape recorder to get? Oh, did he put the full stop there, and there was a semicolon? But if you stand back, you can get a sense of the gist of it. The idea was there, and I think if you look at Baghdad in particular, in the pre-Buyid and then the later Buyid period, it's quite clear. And again, looking at some of the collections that were put together in the immediate aftermath of al-Khulaini during the Hayra period, the Kamil al-Ziyarat, for example. What was the motivation in the compilation of that particular book? You get a lot of attention to the question of ziyarah, much more so than was in al-Kafi or Basair al-Darajat or al-Mahasin. What was going on there? And that's a sense of saying, look, we are who we are, and in that process of working out our own identity, we are juxtaposing our own beliefs and our own ideas, imperfectly and in a gradualist kind of way, with other kinds of ideas. These things we do distinctly that make us distinct. And in the text of that, and I've paid some attention to that, what you begin to see is that the question of ziyarah to Karbala and to other of the Imam's sites is a very important thing. It not only has spiritual merit, which again is part of the point that's in there, but it also is beginning the process of self-identification. And I think that's a thing that you can look at the individual texts, and you can, some historic, we can't believe in them. My question was, yes, but why was it put together in the first place? And what does it say about the nature of the community? So it becomes, if you will, like a coin. It is an objective fact. Somebody decided it was an important thing to do, to gather these traditions together. And this is what these traditions said, and this can only have been the impact. Then you come to the later Sunni sources, which talk about conflicts between Sunnis and Shi'is, for example, in Buyid, Baghdad, over going to Karbala, going to Najaf. Now, was it exactly as that was foretold, the numbers of people, and all? Maybe, maybe not. But you can, if you step back, say it was clearly an issue, it was a point, and that is corroborated by some material evidence, the book on the ziyarat. Ziyarat, Sheikh Mufid writes a thing on ziyarat, and the ziyarah, sorry, depending upon the language, it is now important, and it's important is attested to by the fact of these particular collections here that are there. You have also, talking about the ghaiba, or the ghaibat itself, Khomeini had a student, an Imani, al-Katib al-Imani, who wrote Kitab al-Ghaiba, very long book. What is that all about? Well, it tells you that people were in al-Hayra and were trying to work this out. And some people had him, he talks about it, there are people who have doubts. But the production of the book then is a response to this challenge of how we identify ourselves as a community. What we think is important. We're not necessarily going to seek a fight here. We're not going to get in anybody's face, but we're going to be who we are because this is what we believe. And that is a quiet, calm statement in the face of others. We do things a little differently. Oh, why is that? Why do you do things? Why do you do that? Well, the reason we do that, it's not random. We didn't forget. It's because we believe this. This is what we are about. And things like the event of Karbala itself, the importance of Muharram, of visitation to these sites. Why do you do that? Well, we do this because we think this is important. Well, what's that all about? Well, a long time ago, this happened. And in the face of the whole, everybody being against him, this man went out. Whoa, wow, what's that about?
Dr. Andrew Newman, thank you so much for your time and for some very interesting perspectives.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much again for coming.
We can see from this discussion with Dr. Andrew Newman on the issue of Karbala, particularly in Islamic studies and Shi'i studies, how it has a resonance for everyone who has some interest in human values, in the importance of history, in understanding where we come from as human beings, and also what our priorities are. I'm going to be visiting Professor Sajjad Rizvi at the University of Exeter, who is a practicing Shia and an expert in Shi'i studies. I want to learn about the aftermath of Karbala. What were its political, social and spiritual effects upon not only the Muslim community, but also the non-Muslim world and centuries to come afterwards. Just going into, again, some of the events that actually took place immediately after the killing of Imam Hussein alayhi salam. I mean, we know that there are still some Muslims around the world who believe that Yazid was the rightful caliph and that, in fact, Imam Hussein was, in the wrong, so took the wrong decision and sort of tried to stage an uprising which failed. And one of the arguments I suppose they could use was that
and I've seen some of these narrations also in the Sunni sources, that actually Yazid was quite upset about what happened, and we have this point of him allowing members of Imam Hussein's family to continue to live. They were obviously brought to Syria, as we know. Why did he allow them? Why didn't he completely assassinate all of them?
That's a very good question, and I think, I mean, there's two issues there. One is, you know, what was the role of Ibn Ziyad and the local sort of governorate in southern Iraq, particularly in Kufa, and then what happens once the prisoners get to Damascus. Now, one of the issues is that once they're in Damascus at the court, and they, of course, are made a great show of, the fact of the matter is that the ruler has to treat them as would be appropriate for an Arab emir to treat them. And there's certainly a strong element of Arab sort of tribal values which would kick in. So certain things would have been certainly considered to be shameful and dishonorable for him to do. So for him to then at that stage in Damascus to have killed them, it would not have been acceptable. It's not a question of what is religiously acceptable, it's a question of what the cultural values would have allowed. That doesn't of course mean that they didn't do very brutal things before that, and in many cases one of the interesting things about the Umayyads is that they bring in a rather brutal way of dealing with dissent. So, you know, in effect they, of course, that doesn't mean it didn't exist before, but the Umayyads pretty much established this notion of mutilating people who they killed, particularly mutilating the bodies of those they regard as rebels, beheading them, crucifying them. I mean, this was very much the Umayyad way of dealing with dissent, which then becomes standardized, even so much so that you see it in Umayyad Spain as well. The way they deal with rebels is exactly the same. They mutilate the bodies, they run horses over the bodies, they behead them, they crucify them. Very much what they were doing in Iraq. So you know, there is a certain sort of mode of operating which you see in Umayyad's ways of dealing with so-called rebellion.
So actually, putting that, you know, this in context that, oh well, he allowed the family to live. In fact, it was within this context that they were actually, you know, conducting these acts of brutality, terrorizing people.
And it's a question of what happened really at Karbala already. So, you know, the fact that they weren't killed, that Imam Zain al-Abidin was not killed, in some ways, from a particular perspective, is an accident of what did not happen in Karbala. So once that's already happened, I think it would have been very difficult to go back. And so, you know, as I said, once you're in a particular court setting, you're in, I guess, what you might call the full light of history. And there's certain things which were a bit more difficult to do than what you might do on a battlefield, where there are fewer people who could report otherwise.
That's interesting. Again, looking at accounts of you know, motives, Imam Hussein's motives, alayhi salam, for example, we see in a lot of Western historical accounts of Karbala, as well as obviously some other accounts from other schools of thought, that again his movement is depicted as, like I said, a failed uprising. I just read a couple of days ago an account of how it was depicted as, you know, he attempted to overthrow the existing government and he failed. In your view, why is it that his, we could say, more altruistic motives, his we could say moral and spiritual motives haven't been taken into account? And in your opinion, are they starting to be taken into account?
I think it really depends on what sort of accounts you look at. I mean, one of the problems is, on the one hand, we have what I would call an imperial Islamic conception of the faith. And on the other hand, you have sort of the popular faith of most people, regardless of whether they're Shia or not. And that popular expression was always extremely sympathetic and loyal to the Ahlul Bayt.
Right.
I mean, that's very, very clear from quite an early period. And this was widespread. This was widespread in North Africa. It was certainly true of the Islamic East. So the notion of seeing Hussein as a heroic martyr was probably far more dominant amongst sort of your average believer than any other conception. And that comes across in literature, it comes across in so many different forms of expression that we see in history all the way back to a fairly early period. But of course, that's not necessarily what most scholars and theologians wrote, and so that's where the imperial conception comes out much more. And there, I think it's very much a case of, since at least since about the 11th century, arguably early, you get the development of an imperial conception of authority in which the person who wields power has authority.
Yeah.
And so by definition, anyone who stands against it is illegitimate, regardless of who they are, regardless of how they do it. So in a sense, it doesn't really matter what the details are of the rising of Imam Hussein. It's the very fact that he does it. And if one then recognizes the legitimacy of that rising, then you basically discredit your own political theory.
And also, of course, additionally, people were eventually discouraged even to look into these conflicts. I think Ahmad ibn Hanbal gave an opinion that you shouldn't even look into these.
Yeah, I mean, the position of Ibn Hanbal is kind of interesting because it depends on who is reporting it. So on the one hand, you have reports which say that people cursed Yazid in front of him and he didn't say anything. Other reports say no, he sort of stepped in and said, no, you can't say that. We also know Ibn Hanbal was certainly not clear whether Imam Ali was the fourth caliph.
Oh.
In fact, he seems to have denied it on the whole, because we know that this kind of development of what becomes the Sunni orthodoxy on the four caliphs really only emerges in the 3rd or 4th century Hijri.
Right.
It takes a while for it to emerge because already in the Umayyad period and certainly afterwards there's a very strong element of hostility towards Amir al-Mu'mineen and to the family of the Prophet.
Thank you very much for a very interesting discussion and again illuminating for our viewers. Through this journey I have come to learn that the mission of Hussein ibn Ali deserves greater attention, and the Western secular academic tradition is coming to realise that it needs to be examined not just as a failed uprising or as a political movement, but from its spiritual principles. Hussein ibn Ali's movement was not just for the Muslims in his time, but it was for the whole of humanity for centuries to come.